Book 3, Part 4. Over in the main house, Phil looked up and Marcus followed. Ryan watched his click Alpha, and then the room went quiet as they all did. Phil stood and walked towards the door, reaching for the handle. "Stay," Ryan whispered, his low voice vibrating softly at the end. "We need this information." Phil's hand stopped, inches from the tarnished knob. He looked at it, blinking slowly, his own heart aching for her. Marcus lowered his head, still sitting in the chair. Will drew in a slow breath. They have a hard time being apart. Ryan nodded. Before we were able to locate her, he had gotten pretty bad. The older Alpha nodded back. Like I said, as amazing as Eay-o-tay is, it carries its own heavy price. They all turned to him, except Phil, who still stood staring at the door. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he kept his ears on the conversation. Ryan was right. They needed to know. "You said that the other couple lived here for several years," Ryan stated, keeping his eyes on Phil. "Yup, Elizabeth and Nell lived with us for about 4 years, along with Ron, their protector." The older man sat back in his chair, his arms resting on the smooth wood. "I thought you said they had 2, Ryan stated, now turning back to the room. "They did. Lost the other one just before they came here." Will turned towards the large, thick window next to the door. "These woods are not so friendly, especially to a human that ain't used to them." Phil's eyes widened. "A human?" Ryan snapped, moving to the edge of his own chair. He suddenly wanted to pack everyone up and leave, although he wasn't sure why. "Yep, pure one at that." Will watched them all, but kept his body relaxed. He also knew that they were jumpy and wanted to show them he was only trying to help. He rubbed his chin. "Just like with you here, Ron and the human were in close physical contact with the 2 when it happened. Seems that is what bonds them as protectors." "What were they doing with a human?" Marcus asked. "Ron was a vampire," Will chuckled, "and Elizabeth was actually trying to protect him. The human, that is." Ryan held up his hand, his brows tight. "Wait. Now are you saying that the vampire Ron was going to attack the human, and the Eay-o-tay couple came along, and poof, the attack stopped and they were suddenly one little happy family?" Will threw back his head and laughed. "Not even a little bit," he stated, picking up his cup and taking a drink. He winked at his friend Jax, that was sitting on the couch near Marcus. "Those 2 squabbled the whole time." Ryan shrugged and Will nodded. "They may have been bonded to the couple, but they weren't to each other." He grinned and Ryan's brows lifted. "So, the vampire killed the human?" Phil asked, walking over. "No," Jack stated. "They can't, or so it seems." Ryan let out a growl and then sighed. "I'm sorry, Will. It's just a little frustrating getting the story in small bits." Will sat up then. You are. Sorry about that. You see, Elizabeth and Nell had been running for a while, with no protectors at all. They had trouble back with their own packs. Not sure on the details. They didn't like talking about it much," he stated when Ryan gave him another frustrated glance. "So, they found their way into these woods, setting on hiding out for the rest of their lives, and no more plan than that. They happened on the other 2 by accident, and poof, a family of 2, becomes a family of 4. A very odd family, the other man named Tarkus chuckled. Will nodded. A cougar got the human before we found them. Are you sure it wasn't the vampire? Marcus hissed. Dead sure, Will stated, then chuckled at the pun. See, Elizabeth told us how often Ron had tried to attack the human. He rubbed his chin. I think I might have known his name once, but just can't remember it now. He looked at his 2 packmates, and when they shook their heads, he shrugged. We found them a few weeks after they entered our woods. We knew the minute they came across, Jax put in quickly. Will nodded again. We don't go announcing ourselves, and most just trot on through with the place in mind, he sighed. But they stayed, even built a little shelter, he smiled. Was a pitiful thing, but they had heart, and once we saw they meant to stay, we paid a little visit. His face lit up. She was a beauty, but a fierce little thing, too, he chuckled, and Jax smiled. She was the first to try to attack, matter of fact. Phil was standing in front of the others now, listening, but still feeling the pull from Raina. She was missing him, and he wanted to be with her, but he had to hear this. He had to know what they were up against. We outnumbered them easy enough, but, Will whistled, they fought something fierce. He smiled when he talked. A look of admiration and almost longing sparkled in his hard brown eyes. Ryan watched his body language as much as he listened to what they were telling him. He had an itch telling him there was still more, but there didn't seem to be any lying so far. Phil glanced back towards the door, his eyes on the handle. Ryan's focus changed, and Will nodded. They won't do so well apart. The smile slipped a little, and Jax cleared his throat. Ryan drew in a slow breath, looking down at his laced fingers, then up. I'm sorry for your friends. It seems they were friends? Quite, Will stated. Ryan nodded. I don't mean to sound so insensitive, but... Would I get to the important part? Will grinned. The part that has to do with your couple. Again Ryan nodded and Will shrugged. Not sure that there is a part that doesn't pertain. Jax and Tarkus nodded, and Will clucked his tongue. You sure you want to have this conversation with him here? He asked, glancing at Phil. Why wouldn't I? Ryan said, a low growl escaping with the words. It's not all pleasant, and maybe it's best if you and I talked, and then you sorted out how to tell him, since you know him better. Phil walked back over, his face hard. I am her mate, but I am also a clique alpha, and I want to know, he stated, shooting Will a hard stare, then glanced at Ryan. Ryan nodded. He has a right, and after what he has already been through, I couldn't hold any information back. He can take it. Will rubbed his chin again. All right, then. I see sugarcoating this isn't going to work, so... He looked up at Phil. If either of you die, the other will soon follow. He didn't wait for a reaction, but stood. As wonderful as Eay-o-tay is, it comes with a price. It's magic in its own way, can do things I didn't think possible. But it claims the 2 and shortens their lives. What do you mean shortens their lives? Ryan snapped, also getting to his feet. Now he was doubting his decision to have Phil hear this firsthand. The Owlsaw alpha nodded slowly. Think about it. Those 2 are having a hard time just being a few doors away from each other right now. All eyes turned to Phil, who frowned. Imagine passion like that, hunger like that, coursing through your body 24 hours a day. It's like being revved on adrenaline without the crash to let you rest. Will had a hand in a fist as he spoke. The room went silent, and Tarkus moved to tend the fire. Ryan finally gave a nod. Then we just have to keep them together. He gave a nervous chuckle. I could see how the passion thing would be a bit much on a person, but his eyes narrowed then. When did Nell and Elizabeth leave here? They didn't leave, Will stated, his voice tightening just a bit. We have 'em buried down the pathways with our kin. Phil's eyes widened and Marcus jumped, standing next to him. Ryan put his hand out to his packmates. Obviously these men didn't kill them, but Ryan was liking this whole thing less and less. They weren't wood folks, their alpha stated slowly, guilt washing over his face. He started to pace a bit, and the others stepped back to let him. They tried their best, though, he smiled. Worked hard as any other. Will stopped and looked into the fireplace, not really seeing it. Nell and Ron were out with the logger group gathering up wood. No one saw them go down into the ravine. No one thought to look there, since they shouldn't have gone down there to begin with. The ground was soft, had too many days of rain under it. He glanced over at Jax. We didn't have time to know they were missing. Her scream shook every tree for miles. The man put his hand to his chest. The pain was, well, it felt like we all were dying too. He was a wolf. How did he, Marcus said with a cackle in his voice as he took a protective step closer to Phil. He was a wolf. Like I said, pup, Will stated without anger. He wasn't a woods folk. He could see in the dark, smelled danger if it was alive, but he took the terrain for granted. He stepped wrong, his foot sank, and he fell. Snapped his neck on a downed tree. Even wolf blood can't bring you back from that. He ended in a low voice, dripping with sadness. Phil shook his head. But Elizabeth, how did she... Will sighed, glancing at Ryan. Like I said, Eay-o-tay takes its price. In blood, if it wants to. She killed herself? The Click Alpha gasped. Willed herself to die, more likely to say, the Owlsaw wolf stated. His eyes were watering now. We had to... He turned and cleared his throat. We had to tie her up just to get her back here. Ryan watched the other man's body slump from pain and shame. What about her protector? Marcus snarled, his hackles up and his stance edgy. He wanted to defend Phil, but had no idea against what. When Will didn't answer, Jax did. She shredded him before we could stop her. A wolf against a vampire, Ryan whispered, more to himself. Never said she was one or the other, I don't think, Will put in, and they all looked at him. He watched them for a minute and then nodded to Ryan. She was a hybrid, part wolf, part vampire. The words slammed into the room like a falling tree. But wouldn't have mattered, he continued. That girl turned into something else that day. Pure anger, pure desperation. He cleared his throat, squared his shoulders, then faced Ryan. And within days, she was less than anything I have ever seen. What does that mean? Phil roared, stepping up to the two men. If he died, the bond should have been broken. There was a panic in his eyes as well as his voice. She should have been able to mourn and move on, to live a long life. Ryan put a hand on Phil's shoulder as Will shook his head. Who told you that's how this works? Phil's eyes widened and Will stepped up and faced him. You've been given a gift so wondrous that, well, it makes hard men like me use the word wondrous. He was smiling a bit, trying trying to lower the panic that was swelling in the room. "Tell me, if your Raina were to die, what would you do?" Another bomb of silence, and then Phil turned to Ryan, the pleading in his eyes. "If something happens to me, please don't let her die." Ryan's throat was tight, and he looked back to the other man. "So she stopped eating and just let herself wither?" Will gave a small chuckle that held no humor. "No. Once her anger ebbed enough and the sorrow was greater, she..." He shook his head. "She just stopped her own heart, by sheer will alone, it seems. Even if she didn't have one that beat, she would have just stopped existing." Just then something slammed against the front door, and they all nearly jumped out of their skin. Marcus grabbed Phil and shoved him behind him, crouching into an attack position. Jax and Tarkus ran to the door, and Will and Ryan prepared. "Crap, now you have the whole place ready to shred us." They all stopped when they heard the voice outside. Ryan stood. "Jackson?" he hollered out. Yeah, it's me," came a nervous reply. Ryan growled, walked through the others, and opened the door. Jackson and Rock stood like two schoolboys turning themselves into the principal's office. Their eyes moved past their alpha to where Phil now stood, the panic replaced with irritation and confusion. "Well?" Ryan growled, his eyes tight. Jackson scratched the back of his neck. Well, Raina..." "What's wrong with Raina?" Phil and Marcus replied together, moving up to the now crowded doorway. The other two put their hands up, and Rock shook his head. "Nothing physically. She's just..." He shrugged. "She started to cry, and we can't get her to stop." Jackson nodded, his eyes big. "We tried everything. Phil pushed past them and ran down the path, Marcus and Jax on his heels. Jackson and Rock looked up at their alpha, their tails as close to between their legs as they could be in this form. "We're sorry," Rock stated. Ryan put his hand up, the older alpha's words still sharp in his mind. "You did the right thing." "We did?" They both snapped, their faces showing that wasn't the reaction they had expected. "Minus the single, very hard blow to the door with a room full of already tense wolves," Ryan added, giving half a smile. Jackson punched Rock in the arm. "I told you." Ryan waved his hand. "Not now." They both nodded and then looked at Will as he stepped up. "Amazing is the word most used with Eay-o-tay, but is not always followed by something good." Rock frowned. "What does that mean?" "It can also be amazingly cruel," Will stated in a sad whisper as he walked out the front door. Ryan and the others walked into the other cabin, and Track met him at the door. He shook his head at Ryan. "She just wouldn't stop crying," he said in bewilderment, shaking his head and holding his arms out. Ryan gave a nod, then headed towards the bedroom door. Chapter 5. Raina. I felt a relief wash over me when Phil rushed through the bedroom door. The sadness suddenly slipped away, and I smiled as he dropped to the floor and pulled me into his arms. I moaned softly as I inhaled his scent, almost giggling now. His hand stroked my hair, and I nuzzled into his chest, wrapping my arm around him. Time forgotten, reason forgotten. My wolf was here, and everything in the world was right again. His heart beat too fast, and I whispered to it with my mind, telling it to slow. It listened and found the rhythm of my own to follow. Phil's lips touched the top of my head, and I shivered in a good way. Then his mouth moved down to my ear. "What got you so upset, Tay?" I rubbed my cheek against his chest. "You were so sad, so worried. You were thinking about dying." He sighed and I looked up, the smile gone from my face. I put my hand on his cheek. "Why were you thinking about dying?" The sadness started to seep in again, my red eyes watering. "No, not me," he whispered, smiling and pushing the hair out of my face. "The Alpha here was telling us a story, a sad story, about someone that died here." I bit my lower lip. "Oh," was all I could manage. I suddenly felt like an idiot. He smiled at me, getting more comfortable and keeping his arms around me. "I'm sorry I upset you." My wolf was amazing, and I leaned forward, getting lost in his brown eyes. Then someone cleared their throat, loudly, and I froze. Phil winked at me and I turned. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, looking at Ryan's feet. He was wearing heavy boots now. They were worn but solid, and I tilted my head. I had never seen him in boots before. When he knelt, I flinched. I knew I had it coming, but it didn't mean I would enjoy it. "You're not in trouble, pup," he whispered in a voice so low that I peered at him to make sure I heard him right. He gave me a soft smile, and I wiped at my eyes. "I'm sorry that you all came," I whispered. That was mostly true. I really was sorry the others had come, but I was relieved Phil was here with me. Whatever story they had told him had affected him deeply, and I was glad I stopped them from doing that to him. Track knelt as well, his eyes watching him closely. He still looked worried, and I did feel bad for freaking him out. "I see you shifted," Ryan grinned, changing the subject. I shrugged and nodded. Luckily, they had brought my things, and I was now in a pair of jeans, t-shirt, and one of the men's jackets, which I was swimming in. Ryan looked me over. "Seems we aren't good wood folk either." Marcus gasped, and Ryan chuckled. "Calm there. I was making a joke." He looked at Phil and shrugged. "A poor one, but we aren't staying that long." I frowned, not understanding. Then Phil stood and pulled me up with him. Jackson brought over a wet washcloth, and my look of surprise made him shrug. "Jax brought it." I smiled and wiped my face as the others shifted around the room nervously. "So, is that your pet name for her?" Track smiled, as Phil took my coat off and slipped a heavy knit sweater over my head. It was actually soft, and I smiled as I rubbed my hand over it, wondering if Jax brought this too. "Is what my what?" Phil asked, pulling my hair gently out from the collar. We both turned to him, and he shrugged. "You called her Tay." My brows wrinkled, and Track rolled his eyes and replayed the scene. I looked at Phil, who shrugged. "I don't know. It just came out." Will stepped up smiling. "It's an old wolf word, or part of one." We all looked at the other Pax Alpha, and he nodded. Tay means whole. "So, Tay is half?" Jackson asked, his head tilted to one side. "Or more rightly, it is one half of a whole," the older one said pointedly. I smiled, and Phil nodded. "Well then, it seems to fit." "So, Eay-o-tay means what exactly?" It was Marcus that asked the question, but we all turned to the other man, waiting for his response. "There is no exact translation," he stated. "Plenty of words have tay in them. Eay-o-tay is said to mean finding one's other half of their soul." When no one replied, he added, "A has been said to mean—" I put up my hand smiling. I like it. If we pick it apart, it won't sound so romantic, Jackson asked, with a teasing smile on his face. Sincere, I shot back, smacking his arm playfully. He laughed, and then Ryan straightened. Well then, I think we've had enough talking for one night. The other alpha nodded, and I stepped up, out of Phil's arms, and faced the two men. I am really sorry I disrupted your talk. I looked at the other alpha, but kept my own in my sights. The older man smiled. Like Ryan said, you did nothing wrong. I'm glad we were able to set things right quickly. I'm the one that is sorry. I should have known better. I tilted my head and was about to ask what he meant when I gasped as a pillow hit me in the stomach. Bunk up, she-wolf. Time for lights out. Track was smiling when I looked over at him, the pillow now tight in my own hands. My brows rose and a smile crossed my face. Then Phil stepped up. Not our place to bust up, remember, he chuckled. I bit my lip and nodded, shooting Will an apologetic look for what I had been about to do. Everyone started to clear out, and I walked to my bags. They had brought 2 for me, which seemed excessive. Then again, I had no idea how long we were staying. I pulled out my brush and then my toothbrush. When I found my pajama bottoms and another t-shirt, I stood and turned. Phil was standing there, arms crossed and smiling. I glanced around the room looking for the bathroom door. Then I moaned. He chuckled and I moaned again. They were serious, weren't they? I'm afraid so, he stated, but I can get you some water. He looked at my toothbrush. And if you have to use the... I put my hand up. Luckily, no. Let me know when you're done changing, he smiled, glancing at the clothes in my other hand. I gave a small nod and he left, shutting the door behind him. The fire was warm, so I moved closer and wiped off my clothes, whipped off my clothes, glancing at the windows and trying to judge the thickness of the curtains over them. We may be out in the middle of nowhere, but there were still strange eyes here. When I walked out into the main room, the cold hit me, and I moved a little closer to the fire. Ryan's bed was made on the couch, and Track was set up on his cot. I frowned and was about to argue when Phil stepped up. Bare feet? Huh? I followed his gaze to the floor, and I shrugged. I don't sleep with socks on. You might want to, Track stated, moving his cot closer to the hearth. That fire isn't going to refuel itself while you sleep. My eyes widened and I nodded slowly. I looked at the couch, then at the cot again, and sighed. Really, Ryan, there's plenty of room. Good night, pup, he stated. He was smiling, but his voice wasn't. I sighed again and walked back into the other room, moving over to pull a pair of socks out of my bag. When I sat on the edge of the bed to put them on, Phil sat on the bed across from me. This is ridiculous, I whispered as I pulled the last one on. 2 huge beds in here, and they're sleeping on the floor. Phil smiled, and I shrugged. Well, practically. He stood and walked over, then pulled down the heavy quilt and several blankets. I crawled under them and laid down. Ugh, the bed was harder than I thought. They might be getting the better deal, Phil smiled as he pulled them up over me. The weight of the covers was noticeable, and I looked at the fire. He stood and walked over to it. I'll try to keep an eye on it. What? You need to sleep. I sat up as he picked up a log from the box. You can't stay up all night just to watch that. You're probably right, he chuckled, putting the log on the crackling pile and moving to a chest at the end of my bed. In that case, he pulled out another quilt and fanned it out, letting it crash down on me. I actually grunted, and he smiled. We don't have to worry about me falling out of bed, I huffed. I can't move, I grunted theatrically, pretending to try to wiggle. Phil moved back to the fire, and I watched. He looked so manly tending the fire. I covered my mouth and giggled at my own thoughts. He glanced over his shoulder and I shook my head. My granny always told me that girls carry more secrets than a train carries goods, he snickered, pulling another larger log out of the bin, and far more dangerous if you try to pry. I smiled and looked up at the ceiling. Yep, wood with wood beams. Imagine that. But it was comforting somehow, like knowing that these people worked so hard to build this home with their own hands. Made it seem safer, if that made any sense. When he turned around, he brushed his hands together and then walked over to me. Unlike you, I have needs no matter what form I'm in, he smiled. I cleared my throat and his eyes widened. I mean the bathroom, he stated quickly. I didn't mean that. He poked his thumb towards the door. I nodded. I knew what you meant, but, I smiled softly, suddenly feeling rather brave. I'm not really a pup, no matter what Track likes to think. I couldn't tell if his face got redder or if it was just the light of the fire flickering over him. He cleared his throat and took a full step back. Right, I just have to get my things. He moved over to another duffel bag at the foot of the other bed. He nearly yanked some things out and then headed towards the door. I giggled softly, pulling the blankets up to my mouth to stifle it. He turned and looked at me, winked, and disappeared through it. Need a babysitter while he's gone? Track said as he walked in. He was in sweatpants and a long-sleeved t-shirt now. He's just going to the bathroom, I huffed. He walked over and sat on the side of my bed, shaking his head. You can't call that place a bathroom, Ray, he chuckled. It's more like a creepy closet with this bench thing and... All right. Thanks for the visual, I winced, putting a hand up. He shrugged. It's true. Not a pretty thing. Then he shivered and I smacked his arm. Why are you and Ryan sleeping out there? I whispered, frowning. When he didn't answer, I pulled myself out of the covers enough to sit up, grunting from the effort. I just don't get it. We're a pack. There's plenty of room here. Track smiled. Maybe so, but what Ryan says, he gave a quick bounce. Plus, I think my bed is softer. I frowned and he turned more, bending one of his legs up on the bed. Ray, things are different now. My nose started tingling and he shook his head and pointed at me. No more waterworks. They're gonna think I said something to you and they'll pommel me. That was enough to stop the tingle and I cleared my throat and nodded. He sighed. Just because something is different doesn't mean it's bad, he smiled at me, but I only tightened my brows, confused. Gads, girl, you are so smart sometimes and so not others. Gee, thanks? Look, the you and Phil thing, us being here. He glanced over his shoulder, then looked back at me. His brown eyes were soft and worried. Ray, do you even know why we're here? When I only blinked, he ran a hand through his hair. They all seemed to do that when they were frustrated, and it seemed to happen a lot around me. I bit my lower lip. I don't really think about it, I finally confessed. He looked at me and I shrugged. You guys said we needed to come. Yes, but there was a low growl from the other room and he sighed. Are you hungry? Huh? Hungry. Do you need your thermos? Oh. I concentrated and then shook my head. You haven't needed that in a while, he stated, his eyes watching me closely. Track, came the stern voice of our alpha from the other room, and my best friend let out a small growl of his own. Probably because I'm eating so much when I shift, I smiled. He nodded without returning the smile, and I reached out and put my hand on his. I trust you, I whispered. All of you. That didn't make him smile either. In fact, he looked miserable now. We both turned when Ryan stepped into the room and Track sighed. Yeah, I know. Our Alpha walked over and I smiled up at him. I was just trying to figure out why you two are sleeping out there when there's so much room in here. Someone has to watch the front, Ryan stated, shooting my best friend a hard look. Well, why didn't you just say so? I chuckled. Gads, it's like there was some dark secret floating around here the way... My voice trailed off when he turned away from me to avoid my eye contact. Okay, seems I've struck a nerve. Again. It would be a lot easier not to say the wrong thing if I knew what the wrong thing was. Our Alpha turned back. You need to get your sleep. I have a feeling this pack gets up much earlier than we're used to. He shot me a quick grin and then left the room. Men, I huffed, but softly. Did you just call me a man? Track teased. I rolled my eyes and then Phil walked back into the room. He was wearing dark gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt now. I could see the muscles in his arms and across his chest, and I smiled with pride, wolf pride. He looked at Track and then sat on the chest and untied the heavy boots. She needed a babysitter, he stated, and then hopped off the bed before I could make contact. Phil smiled and put his boots near the door. Well, Nanny Track, your duty here is done now. I laughed, and Track wrinkled his nose at me, gave me a kiss on the forehead, then walked back into the other room, leaving the door halfway open. I bit my lower lip, smiling at the gesture that said, I have my eye on you. Phil chuckled too, winked at me, walked over, and finished closing the door. I pulled the blankets over my mouth and laughed as I heard Track cuss and Ryan reprimand him for it. Night, John boy, came Rock's happy voice from the other side of the wall. Night, Sue Ellen, Jackson replied, and then grunted loudly. Who you callin' Sue Ellen? Rock hollered. There were several thumps and grumps, and then one big one. I winced. That had to hurt. Go to sleep, was all Ryan said, and the abuse ended. Phil chuckled and blew out the 2 oil lamps on the dressers, then the ones next to each bed. The fire gave off plenty of light, and I looked up, watching it dance shadows and colors over the ceiling. It was actually beautiful, like dancers hopping and twisting around quickly but flawlessly. When he bent over the bed, I jumped a little and his brows rose. Sorry, was watching the fire dancers, I smiled, pointing up. His dimples showed, and I reached out and touched it, softly tracing it. His skin was warm, and I opened my palm and laid it on his cheek. He gave a soft moan and then sat down next to me. I smiled up at him, feeling his heartbeat pick up, matching my own. You can't be serious, came Rock's voice, and we both froze, still looking at each other. The walls may be made of thick wood, but sounds carried well. We heard Ryan get up, open their door, and even though we couldn't make out the words, the tone was obvious. Time to get some sleep then, Phil smiled at me, and I nodded. I went to move over, but he stood and walked to the other bed. What was he doing? I watched him pull back his own covers and slid in. I blinked hard and looked up at the ceiling. Why was he sleeping over there? We were wolves. Even if we weren't, we were... The Eay-o-tay was deeper than even being married. They all said that. A sadness washed over me and I turned the other way, my back to him. I pulled the covers up and wondered what I had misunderstood. The room suddenly felt huge, cold, and lonely. I took one of the pillows and held it as I drifted off into sleep. The dreams came quickly. I was sitting on top of a grassy hill, looking at a large ocean of water. Behind me was a massive field of grass. My knees were pulled up to my chin, and I wrapped my arms around them. Like the water, I felt sad, alone, and unsure why I wasn't wanted. How I knew the water felt that way, I have no idea. It was a dream, after all. Am I too ugly? I whispered to it, watching it wash up on the sand below, linger, and then fade back out. But it didn't answer. I rested my chin on my knees, contemplating. Maybe he doesn't really want me. My heartbeat skipped and my head shot up. Maybe he wishes the Eay-o-tay happened with someone else. I jumped to my feet, my mind racing. There had been someone else in his life. Or at least, I thought maybe there had. I turned, not wanting to share my pain even with the water. So many holes in my mind. Why didn't I remember? I felt my chest tighten. That must be it. He was being kind, but inside he was aching for someone else. I started to run down the hill, trying to outrun the thoughts that were painful. Now he is tied to you forever and does not want you, the wind whispered in my ears and laughed as I started to cry. You have bound another's love to you. How selfish and cruel you are, it accused. That stopped me in my tracks, and I turned, my fists tight. I didn't do this, I screamed. How could I? I'm just me, I raged, but the wind swirled around me, chuckling. You are a witch and cast a spell on him, you evil girl, it hissed. You spelled him well and crushed his heart to claim it as your own. No, I whimpered, the anger falling away. No, I didn't. I wouldn't. I have no such powers. You do and you did, it spat, swirling closer, rubbing against me. I tensed and pulled my arms to my chest to try to keep out of its reach. He cannot even lay with you because of it, it taunted, and I turned, fear and shame filling me. You are ugly, it spit in a vile purr, ugly for what you have done, ugly for the joy you are getting from his pain. No, please no, I sobbed, turning slowly, my arms tightly around me. I would never do something like that. The wind suddenly stopped then, and I tensed, looking around for it. Then perhaps you are just ugly, it stated, and I peered outwards, trying to see it. You look and dress like a boy. You act like one most of the time, too, except when you're sobbing like a little baby. I stiffened, and it chuckled in a low, eerie voice. One of the boys, that's what you are. He deserves so much more, so much better. It slithered up to me again and began its slow circle, like a bully to its victim. Someone that he is proud to have on his arm. Someone pretty that does her hair and cares about how she looks. I can do that, I whispered, nodding at the nothing that was being so cruel. But it was right. I never wore makeup, barely ran a brush through my hair. I moaned softly and dropped to my knees, looking down at myself. My hands were dirty, my nails chipped and caked with more dirt. You are not worthy of such a wolf, it hissed, though less harshly. I can be, I stated, rubbing my hands across the grass even harder, trying to get the dirt off. I will be. When the wind didn't respond, I looked up. Tell me what I need to do. Silence. I stood up, looking around. Please, please just tell me. I'll do whatever I have to. The wind was either gone or was sadistically enjoying this. I didn't care. I needed to know what I had to do. Please, I yelled, turning one way and then the other. Please help me. Eay-o-tay, I heard a voice whisper from far away. I turned, putting a hand over my eyes, trying to see. "Eay-o-tay," came a soft echo. "Tay." Suddenly my body started to shake, and I flung my arms out to stop it. "Tay," it whispered again. Then my eyes shot open, and I gasped as Phil's nose was only inches from my own. "Shh, you were just dreaming," he whispered, but I heard other voices and looked past him. They were all in here now. I moaned and turned away from them. "I'm sorry. Please go back to sleep," I managed to whisper, hiding my face and hands from them. "Ray, please," I whispered again, my voice shaking. I heard Ryan say something, and then their footsteps as they left the room. Phil's hand touched my shoulder, and I felt the tears come. How could he look at me? I was ugly, a boy, and I hadn't even cared. He was so incredibly wonderful to act like that didn't matter. But how could it not? What man wants to be with a girl that is so not a girl? "If you talk about the bad dreams, it helps," he finally said, the worry heavy in his voice. I made him worry a lot. I could almost hear the wind chastising me for that too. "I'm sorry I woke you," I whispered. He chuckled. "I'm sorry I didn't wake you sooner." I frowned. What did that mean? "I'm fine," I replied, trying to wipe the tears without him seeing. "I just need to sleep." He didn't reply for a long moment. Then he leaned over and whispered in my ear, "I am right here." Then he got up and walked over to that other bed. My heart crashed, and I clamped my mouth tightly as more tears ran down. Right here? Even with me so upset he wouldn't lay with me? How hideous was I? How did I not realize it all these years? Track. My tears stopped. He's my best friend. Why didn't he tell me? Well, not tell me I was hideous, but why didn't he tell me I should do something with myself? I groaned and then put my face into the pillow when I heard Phil shift. How humiliating. I laid there most of the night trying to figure out this small puzzle. Tried to think of things I could do, knowing we had limited means here. By morning, I was determined to fix this and be the woman that Phil deserved to have, no matter what. I finally dozed off when I heard birds start to sing. I didn't dream much this time, but I did grunt a few times and vaguely heard people complaining about curtains. What an odd thing to dream about, but I rolled over, pulled the blankets over my head, and drifted back off. When I finally did wake, I smiled again. I had a plan. The room was still very dark. Good. I hadn't slept the whole night away. The bed across the room was quiet, and I used all my stealth to slip out, trying not to shiver when the cold slapped me. The fire was full, but I gently laid another long log on it and knelt there for a minute, letting it warm me. Then I glanced at my hands and gripped my teeth, then tried to rub the dirt from the log off on my pajama pants. My bags were still on the chest at the end of my bed, and I took my time to pull the zipper open without making any noise. I was rather proud of myself when I got it open and started rummaging through it. I sighed. Great. Nothing but jeans and t-shirt. Is this really all I owned? Okay, it was, but that was going to have to change. I finally settled on some clothes and scooped them up. Then I remembered there was no bathroom. Trying not to moan, I moved to the far corner and quickly changed. The t-shirt was wrinkled from being wadded up in the bag, and I tried my best to push them out. It didn't help. My brush was harder to find, and I almost tipped the bag over, but caught it. Then I sat and brushed my hair. 100 strokes to shine like a queen, I thought to myself, remembering that phrase from somewhere. I counted each stroke and even added another dozen for good measure. My hair did feel softer, or so I thought, as I crammed the brush back in. Okay, I thought. With my toothbrush and washcloth in hand, I will sneak into the kitchen. There should be some sort of water in there. I took a quick peek at the other side of the room and then made my way to the door. The handle squeaked and I froze. But when I heard nothing behind me, I turned it the rest of the way quickly and hurried through. Then I did freeze, my eyes wide. All of the others were sitting in the main room and were now all looking at me, including Phil. I gasped and turned, rushing back into the bedroom and slamming the door behind me. I hurried over to the other bed and then moaned. As I got closer, I realized it was made, and that what I had thought was Phil's body was his bag and a folded-up blanket next to it. I sighed and flopped onto the bed. So much for that plan. The door opened and I didn't look up. Mind telling me what that was? Came Track's voice, and I let out my breath. At least it wasn't Phil. I thought everyone was asleep, I admitted. I didn't want to wake anyone. He chuckled and walked over. It's noon, wolf girl. We've been up. My head shot up and he nodded. You slept like the dead, so we let you, he shrugged. I flung myself backwards and then grunted when I landed on the duffel bag. I reached behind and yanked it out, staying on my back. What in the world is wrong with you today? He laughed, plopping down next to me. Today? He chuckled and nodded when I looked at him. I bit my lower lip. Then I had an idea. I sat up so fast he jumped a bit. Track, I need your help, I said excitedly. Help with what? He asked, obviously not sure what to make of me. I need you to take me to town, to a store. What? Please? I need to get some things. Why does that make me nervous coming from you? I shook my head quickly. Seriously, Track, will you take me? No. I winced. Why not? It's a human town, Ray. So? He frowned. You don't do so well around humans. My head tilted. I don't? No, you don't. You don't remember? I waved my hand. Now that you mention it, I do, sort of, but that isn't the point. I chewed my lower lip and then nodded. Then I need you to go into town and pick up some stuff for me. I frowned, looked him over hard, and then jumped up. When I got to my own bags, I started rummaging through them again. Did you bring my wallet? You own a wallet? He chuckled nervously. I need my credit cards. I don't carry cash, but my debit card will work. They don't question those. I started yanking things out and he walked over. Ray, I didn't bring your cards. Okay, I'll need to borrow some money from you then. I put my hands on my hips and looked around. I need a pen and a paper to make a list. Slow it down, Ray, he stated, blocking my path. He put his hands on my shoulders. What's going on? I smiled at him and then leaned forward and kissed his cheek. Not to worry, I have everything under control. He blinked hard as I ducked under his arm and started looking through a dresser. Ah, here we go. I pulled out a pad of paper and a pencil. Wow, people still use pencils? I chuckled. Then I walked back over, shoved my bag out of the way, and sat on the chest. Let's see. Then I began to make my list. Track knelt and looked up at my face. Ray, what's going on? Shh, I have to think, I whispered, still grinning. He smiled, shook his head, and then glanced at the paper. His eyes got big. Whoa there, what the? He snatched the paper and stood. I jumped up and tried to get it back. There is no way I'm walking into any store and getting this shit. The door opened then, and we stopped. Him with the list up over his head, and me trying to yank it out of his hand. His other arm was blocking me, and we stayed that way, like two statues, as Ryan and Phil walked in. Phil chuckled, and Ryan's brows rose. I recovered first, quickly running my hand over my hair and trying to pull my shirt hard enough for the wrinkles to look, well, less wrinkled. Again, it didn't work. Track straightened, and Ryan looked at the paper in his hand. Please don't show him, I thought, and saw Phil look at me. Dang it, there had to be some way to talk to just one of them without the other one hearing. Our alpha stepped up, and Track quickly shoved the list back in my hand. Ryan watched us quietly, which was a little unnerving. Finally, Track shrugged. Sorry, just ribbing her. So it seems. With that, my best friend bailed, and I was left with the other two, who were both staring at me like I had gone mad. I smiled, cleared my throat, and looked at the door. Sorry about that. I thought it was the middle of the night, and I was trying to get to the kitchen without waking anyone. Ryan frowned and looked at Phil's bed, then nodded. The lumps could look like a person if you didn't try too hard. It's past noon. Yeah, Track told me, I shrugged. Another awkward moment, and Ryan nodded. So, you were headed to the kitchen for... Oh, I stated, and quickly picked up my toothbrush and washcloth and waved it as evidence. My alpha looked down at the paper in my hand, but I ignored it. Finally, he looked at Phil and then left. I let out my breath, and Phil chuckled. We put covers on the windows while you were sleeping. He stated, they weren't made to keep the sunlight out. Oh, thanks, I replied weakly, suddenly remembering my appearance and looking at the floor. I won't ask what's on that paper, he stated, stepping up closer to me. It's not a secret, I chuckled, trying to sound nonchalant. He looked at me, and I shrugged. Okay, it is, sort of. He smiled, and I sighed. I wanted Track to go into town. Well, actually, I wanted him to take me. Phil went to say something, but I shook my head. Yeah, humans, I know. So I wanted him to go, and I was making him a list. I can get you whatever you need. Wow. Why didn't I see that coming? Great. Now what do I say? Think, girl, think. Well, you can't see the list, I stated, letting myself smile and making sure it was soft. His brows rose, and he stepped closer. Really, he replied, the smile moving to his eyes. It's a secret, I whispered playfully. Phil walked around me slowly. A secret from me and Ryan, but not from Track. There was no anger in his voice. He was enjoying the play. His wolf body language showed it. He was stalking me playfully, watching me but keeping his movements slow and almost sexy. My heartbeat quickened, and I lowered my eyes just a little. Yes, I said in a soft voice, letting a small vibration come out at the end. It surprised me. I had never done that before, but the low moan that I got from him told me I had done something he liked very much. My skin tingled. As your click alpha, I could demand that you show it to me, he whispered, leaning in as he circled, his hands behind his back, a show of negative aggression. I only smiled, keeping my eyes about chest level, but relaxing my body. I heard him inhale slowly, and I closed my eyes, feeling him move around me. It was almost intoxicating, and I swayed just a little. As your mate, I could simply take it. His voice was very low now. It's only its own rumble working through the words. I did moan then. My lips parted and my breath came faster. I licked my lips and then caught my breath as he pressed near my ear. But I think I like this game better, he whispered from behind me. I smiled again, keeping my eyes closed, letting my other senses come alive. His breath was warm and close to my neck, and I tilted it, just barely. Offering a vulnerable spot was submissive to an alpha, but something else told me it meant much more right now, with him. He moaned again and moved closer, his lips so close my skin prickled. My chest rose and fell fast, and I couldn't stop it. I tilted it slightly more, feeling my hair fall away, exposing my skin. His hand came up and rested lightly on my shoulder. His head lowered, and he brushed his lips across my bare neck. I moaned louder, my knees going weak. I had to will them not to buckle and ruin this. I love you, he whispered. His whisper was now shaky, and his grip on my shoulder tightened just a bit. So much. There was a grinding to his voice now, and my emotions picked it up. He was fighting to keep control. Why? I opened my eyes and turned, looking up at him, pleading with my eyes. Don't stop, I let them say. I saw pain in his eyes, and he blinked quickly, then turned away. The powerful sensations were yanked from me, and I gasped for breath, holding my stomach. I'll have Track go to town and get your things, he stated, sounding like he was talking through clenched teeth. Then he turned and almost ran out of the room. The tears fell quickly that time, and I stood in the middle of the darkened room, looking at the open door. What had I done to make him run from me? What hadn't I done? What was I doing wrong? Self-loathing rose up, and I wanted to beat holes in the walls to vent my rage. Even the power of Eay-o-tay coursing through our veins couldn't make him want me. And that's where I'm going to stop.